Welcome back to Life Group, everybody. Hopefully so far, this season of Life Groups has been amazing for you. Now, in our weekend worship experiences this weekend, we talked about the multiplication principle. Now, I'm sure all of you were in a weekend worship experience, right? But just in case you weren't, or perhaps you caught it online, I want to talk about this amazing story in Luke chapter 9. In fact, our memory verse, Luke 9:17, says this: "They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over." You see, this is an amazing story where Jesus is with this enormous crowd of people, and a young man offers his lunch as an offering. And there's this idea that surfaces, this reality that the more I give, the more it actually produces. You see, the first step in being generous is actually recognizing the needs that are all around me. What needs are all around you in your everyday life? Who do you see that is hurting and broken and poor and needs you to offer your lunch to make a difference in their life? Because that's the secret, simply offering what I have for God to bless. You might be thinking that what you have isn't a lot. I just have a little lunch. It's a Lunchable. What can I do with my Lunchable? Well, if you offer to God as a blessing and you give it generously, it simply unlocks the miraculous. See, it doesn't matter if what you have is a lot or a little. It's about giving it to God, and He'll use it to shake the planet. Okay, so now you're caught up. You're up to speed on the weekend. I want to talk about this specific question. What are the areas in your life, in your workplace, your relationships, or life situations that, you are encountering that you would want to participate in seeing God do what is seemingly impossible? All right, take a couple minutes and talk about that. Okay, so you've had some time to talk about that. Let me ask you this question. How are you seeing God's blessing in your life right now? And is it hard to trust God when you find yourself, frankly, without a lunch? How do you view God in your life, in your difficulties, and even in your victories?
You know, sometimes we as Christians can be totally misled into thinking that there's really not much that we as individuals can do to impact this world for Christ. I know that one person can make a tremendous difference. And I'm going to provide you with a simple little illustration of how it is that you and I can have a tremendous impact on the world around us. The difference each one of us can make does not require any extraordinary talent, and that's super important to remember, or a large amount of finances to shake up the world we live in. What it takes is for all of us to use the principles of multiplication that Jesus taught us. So let's take a moment to consider this possibility. A Christ follower leads one person into a relationship with Jesus each year, and then spends the rest of that year investing in and discipling that new Christ follower. So by the end of the year, both the original Christian, the first one, and then the new Christian, they each lead someone else to Christ. And then that same process starts all over again and again and again and again. Now, if this occurred over a span of just 25 years, only 25 years, there would be 33 million new Christ followers. Now, in theory, the world's population of 6.3 billion people could be reached in less than 34 years. Now, obviously, there will always be variables in this process, due to death and sin and laziness a lot. But the power that each one of us possesses to share the hope of the gospel should move us into action. And not only can the principle of multiplication produce a huge return of Christ followers, it really enables us to produce followers who are fully devoted to following God in every aspect of their lives. Now, I'm not trying to oversimplify the task of global outreach or really minimize the moving of the Holy Spirit. However, even Jesus himself trained his disciples in the principles of multiplication. What I want to do today is spend our time looking at a few lessons, just a couple of the lessons in the principle of multiplication. So question number one, before we continue, I want your group to discuss the following questions together. Just they're in your group. So number one, when was the last time you shared your faith with somebody? And what has stood in the way of your sharing your faith with others? So go ahead and discuss that. In the past, you may have heard me or our other campus pastors at Newbreak talk about what we call God math. And this is the way God supernaturally multiplies whatever we give Him in order to achieve His purposes. So let's focus on one of the great accounts in the Bible that demonstrates this principle of multiplication, this God math. All four of the Gospels speak to the miraculous account of the feeding of the 5,000. And this happens by the multiplication of 5 loaves of bread, and then there's 2 fish that a boy offers up to the crowd. And I want to take a moment and look at a part of this account that's often overlooked. We have to remember that the disciples, they had returned from their mission that they were involved in that day. And they were both, super stoked. They were exhilarated, but they were also exhausted. And they needed a rest, a break from the multitudes, from the crowds. And Jesus, too, was dealing with grief because he'd heard of John the Baptist's death and burial and asked the disciples to join him in a solitary place where they could really just rest and regroup together and kind of process what had gone on. And Mark's gospel records his invitation. It says, then because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place to get some rest. And in Mark's gospel, he tells us that they tried to escape the multitudes by boat near the town of Bethsaida in order to rest. But what I find interesting is that Jesus and his disciples, they really didn't succeed in losing the crowds and losing the multitudes, nor did they get their much needed rest. But Mark tells us, but many who saw them leaving recognized them, and then they ran on foot from all the towns around and got there ahead of them. So when Jesus landed and then he sees this large crowd, it ends there with Mark 6:33 and 34. Can you imagine it? All the people running along the rocky shoreline, keeping Jesus's boat in sight and then calling out to the others who were there. And then they told others where the boat might land next. And as the masses anticipate where the boat will touch land, by the time the boat's bottom crunches onto the gravelly beach, the shore is already crowded with people and more coming. So as weary as he and his disciples were, Jesus didn't turn them away. He didn't complain or become testy. Instead, he makes them feel welcome. In Luke 9:11, it says, the crowds learned about it and followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God. And he healed those who needed healing. We see here that Jesus made the time and he shared his gift of healing to serve the people. But what happened next is a miracle of multiplication. And that is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. So there's Jesus. He's there in a deserted place along a shore, shore of the Lake of Galilee, far away from any town. And then Jesus, he welcomes the crowds and makes them feel wanted. And Mark's gospel shares that Jesus, and it says, he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And while John's gospel adds that this takes place on a mountainside where Jesus sat down with his disciples there. And a hillside like this gave the crowd a much, much better visibility and the ability to really hear better too. So for hours and hours, Jesus taught and healed in this place and spoke to a crowd that was about 2 times the size of all of our Newbreak campuses combined. Can you imagine it? Can you just picture it? And then in each of the Gospels, the disciples came to Jesus at the end of this long, long day and asked him to close the meeting, please, so that the people could get a meal before beginning the long walk home. I mean, can you just picture it? Can you just imagine the disciples pleading and trying to wrap up their time with the crowd? only to hear Jesus reply for the disciples to give the crowd something to eat. John 6:6 explains that Jesus anticipated this moment. And it says he asked this only to test Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Jesus. So next came the disciples' protest, that this would take a huge amount of money. Are we going to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? 200 denarii equaled approximately 8 months of a man's wages. And you and I, we often make the same mistakes. We don't believe that we have enough time, enough talent, or enough money to make a difference. That's our dilemma. So question number 2. Do you ever feel like you don't have enough time, talent, or money to give to God? Why do you think that is? So Jesus continues to push the disciples and us into further areas in this lesson. Mark records in the gospel this question. Jesus asks, "How many loaves do you have?" In other words, Jesus is asking the disciples to check their resources and then tell Jesus what the disciples found. So there must have been some discussion among them, among the disciples at this, as they went roaming about, looking in the baskets and the crowd's belongings. And then John chapter 6, verse 8, fills in an important detail. It says, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, he spoke up and he said, "Hey, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" The disciples themselves, they didn't have any bread at all, but they found some that a boy's mom had packed him, in a lunch. Now, I find it rather comical that the boy is the only one who comes prepared. But I find it truly inspiring that he shared it willingly. The disciples knew that there wasn't enough food, and at this point, they knew that they couldn't do it on their own. You ever felt like that? And Jesus is trying to teach the disciples and us that the contributions and the commitments of the disciples must be a part of the solution, however tiny and inadequate. So then Jesus, he takes the loaves and the fish, and he lifts his eyes up to the heavens, and he blesses them. Then imagine, after asking for the Father's blessing, he started giving the baskets to the disciples to set before the people. Now, this must have taken a couple of 100 trips. And after a lot of breaking of bread and, fish to each of the seated groups, Jesus and the disciples, they must have been serving the crowd food in this manner for hours and hours. I mean, this event continued until everyone had eaten their fill, only to find that there were 12 baskets left over. Mark Batterson, the author, he makes the following observation about this whole scene, and he says this: "This is so important. If you keep what you have, you'll never have leftovers. If you wait till you have leftover time, you'll never have time to serve. If you wait till you have leftover money, you'll never have money to give." I'm absolutely convinced that the key to getting what you want is giving up what you have. If we buy into these 3 lies, we forfeit miracles. If we hang on to our lunch, thousands of people go hungry. That's a great quote, isn't it? Now, at some point after this, the crowd began their long walk home, stuffed with food and amazed by what they had seen. Now, let's spend some time examining how we can apply these principles in our everyday lives. Practical. So question number 3. How are you living out the principle of multiplication in your life right now? And maybe even, are you? Or is this a new concept in your lives? Be as practical as you can. Question number 4. So now that we've examined the principle of multiplication, how does this empower you to be more generous with your time, your treasure, and your talents in your everyday life? And how will you actively apply these concepts to your interactions with others this coming week? I want to ask your facilitator to now pray over the group and all the answers and the stories that you've discussed with each other. You know, I just want you to have a great soulful time of prayer. And I want to encourage each one of you to really seek God and ask Him what time, talents, or treasure you need to surrender in order to follow Jesus with everything you've got, like the disciples, holding nothing back. And in closing, I want to encourage you to take a look at Acts chapter 2, verses 14 through 47, and 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 through 15 this coming week as you continue to wrestle with God with this whole idea of multiplication. As you review it, I want to challenge you to think about the purpose of giving to God. Have a great week, and God bless you all.